There was a time, not so long ago, when launching a game felt like a small miracle. Your computer fan screamed like a jet engine warming up on a runway. Your screen flickered. The frame rate stuttered somewhere between playable and painful. And yet, you sat there, eyes wide, heart racing, because 30 frames per second felt absolutely smooth. That was the world that built Radeon. A world where graphics cards were temperamental machines. Drivers were terrifying documents you installed while holding your breath, and every new GPU generation felt like stepping into uncharted territory. If you lived through those years, you remember the feeling. If you didn't, buckle in, because this story is worth knowing. The year was 2000. AMD Technologies, a Canadian company founded in the mid-1980s, had been quietly building momentum in the graphics industry for years. But the launch of the Radeon 7000 series marked something different, a deliberate, confident step into the future of real-time three-dimensional graphics. Before this moment, most of the computational work required to render three-dimensional images was handled by the central processing unit, the CPU, the brain of your computer. The GPU was a support act. ATI changed that equation. The Radeon 7000 series shifted real graphical workloads onto the graphics card itself, freeing the CPU for everything else, and opening the door to visual experiences that simply were impossible before. It sounds technical, but what it meant in practice was simple. Games looked better, ran faster, and pushed deeper into realism than anyone had seen in a consumer product. ATI had drawn a line in the sand. Then came the Radeon 8500, and the line moved even further. The 8500 introduced something called programmable shaders, a technology that gave developers the ability to write custom instructions for how light, shadow, and texture interacted with every surface in a scene. Before shaders, games rendered everything through fixed, rigid rules. With shaders, water could ripple convincingly. Metal could catch light with genuine depth. Skin could look like skin. This wasn't just a hardware upgrade. It was a philosophical shift in what graphics cards were supposed to do. AMD wasn't just building faster chips, it was building tools for artists. And the gaming world, even if it didn't fully understand the technology, felt the difference immediately. But feeling the difference and owning the market are two separate things. That ownership came with the 9000 series. The Radeon 9 700 Pro, launched in 2002, is still spoken about in reverent tones by people who were there. At the time, NVIDIA had been the dominant force in consumer graphics for years, riding the success of the GeForce lineup with what felt like unstoppable momentum. The 9700 Pro ended that assumption without ceremony. It outperformed NVIDIA's flagship cards in nearly every benchmark that mattered. It introduced DirectX 9 support before competitors had a credible answer. And it did all of this at a price point that made enthusiasts pay attention. For the first time, Radeon wasn't chasing the competition. It was setting the pace. Gamers noticed. Hardware reviewers took notice. And an entire generation of builders made their first deliberate choice to go red. By the mid-2000s, the GPU industry had entered what can only be described as a swagger era. The X series, spanning cards from the X300 all the way to the X850, brought style alongside substance. These were the years when graphics card marketing became theatrical, when box art looked like science fiction, and when the phrase Platinum Edition actually meant something. The X800 XT Platinum Edition went directly at NVIDIA's best offerings, matching or beating them in rasterization performance, while ATI emphasized something the competition had undervalued: image quality. ATI's approach was never purely about raw speed. Engineers at the company pushed anti-aliasing technology, anisotropic filtering, and color accuracy in ways that made their cards feel better to use, even when raw frame rate numbers were close. There is a reason so many photographers and creative professionals of that era quietly preferred Radeon monitors and adapters. The attention to how things looked, not just how fast they rendered, was baked into ATI's DNA from the beginning. But every story has a difficult chapter, and Radeon's arrived with the HD 2000 series. Unified shaders were the headline feature, a genuinely revolutionary architectural decision that allowed the same processing cores to handle multiple different types of graphical workloads. On paper, it was the future. In practice, the first generation struggled. Power draw was the villain. The HD 2900 XT, the flagship of that generation, consumed power at a rate that shocked consumers and stressed power supplies across the world. Heat became a constant companion. Reviews were mixed. The card that was supposed to cement Radeon's lead instead became a cautionary tale about prioritizing innovation over execution. ATI had been acquired by AMD in 2006, becoming AMD's graphics division. And one of the first tests of that new leadership structure was navigating this turbulent period with honesty and resolve. The answer came quietly, without fanfare: the HD 3000 series. The 3000 cards didn't dominate benchmarks. They didn't generate viral headlines. What they did was rebuild trust. Cooler, more efficient, more stable, these cards reminded buyers that Radeon could deliver reliability alongside ambition. They were the engineering equivalent of an apology delivered through competence. No words, just results. And they prepared the ground for what was about to follow. Because what followed was a golden era. The HD 4000 and 5000 series remain, to this day, among the most beloved product generations in graphics card history. The HD 4870, released in 2008, became an almost mythological device in budget PC building circles. It delivered performance that only months earlier would have required spending twice as much money. Gamers who had been sitting on the sidelines, watching the enthusiast market from a distance, suddenly found themselves able to participate. AMD had made a decision that changed the competitive landscape. It would use performance per dollar as a weapon. While competitors focused on raw performance at any price, AMD targeted the enormous middle of the market where most real people actually lived. The results were extraordinary. The HD 5870 extended that philosophy into the high end, launching with DirectX 11 support, and becoming the first widely available card capable of driving multiple monitors simultaneously in a meaningful gaming setup. Eyefinity technology, AMD's multi-display system, turned a single gaming PC into a panoramic experience. It was the kind of feature that made people stop mid-sentence at LAN parties and simply stare. Then came the architecture that defined a decade. Graphics Core Next, known simply as GCN, arrived with the HD 7000 series in 2012. And it changed the trajectory of Radeon in ways that took years to fully appreciate. The HD 7970 was its flagship expression, and it became one of the most enduring graphics cards ever made. What made GCN remarkable wasn't just its launch performance. It was how well the architecture aged. Cards built on GCN continued receiving driver support, performance improvements, and new feature compatibility long after comparable NVIDIA products from the same era had been left behind. Overclockers discovered that these chips had reserves of untapped performance that could be unlocked with careful tuning. Enthusiasts who bought HD 7970s in 2012 were still gaming on them in 2016, comfortably, competitively, and without apology. In a market defined by disposability, GCN was built to last. The middle of the decade brought the R series, the R5, R7, and R9 families, and with them, a new approach to market segmentation. AMD looked at its customer base and made a deliberate decision to speak directly to three different kinds of buyers. The R5 cards targeted people for whom price was the primary concern: students, first-time builders, people upgrading from integrated graphics. The R7 range addressed the practical majority who wanted capable performance without excess. And the R9 family was where AMD tested its boldest ideas. The R9 Nano was a remarkable example of this boldness. A tiny card, built for small form-factor systems, that delivered performance previously reserved for full-sized enthusiast hardware. The R9 Fury X introduced high-bandwidth memory, a completely new type of VRAM architecture developed in partnership with SK Hynix, stacking memory chips directly on top of the GPU die for dramatically increased bandwidth in a smaller physical footprint. These weren't incremental upgrades. They were experiments in what graphics hardware could become. Then came the RX 400 and 500 series, and Radeon came home to its people. The RX 480, launched in 2016, became the card that a generation of gamers built their systems around. 1080p gaming, the resolution that defined mainstream PC gaming for most of that decade, was where these cards lived. They handled it effortlessly, quietly, and at prices that made the decision easy. The RX 500 series extended that success with refinements rather than reinvention. These were cards you recommended to friends without hesitation. Cards that ended up inside gaming PCs on every continent, in every kind of home, serving every kind of gamer. They weren't glamorous. They didn't win spec sheet wars. But they were everywhere, and they worked. Vega was a different kind of card entirely. Launched in 2017, the Vega architecture brought genuine computational muscle designed for both gaming and professional workloads. Machine learning researchers took notice. Video editors appreciated the raw throughput. But for the gaming market, Vega presented a familiar problem: heat and power consumption that required compromise. The Radeon 7, which followed in 2019, was a 7-nanometer chip with 16 gigabytes of high-bandwidth memory too, specifications that sounded more like a workstation product than a gaming card. In many ways, it was. AMD was demonstrating what its engineers could do at the process level, signaling to the industry that the company's ambitions extended far beyond gaming frames per second. These were important cards even if they were complicated ones. RDNA arrived in 2019 with the RX 5000 series, and it felt like a breath of fresh air. The Radeon DNA architecture was built from the ground up to address the efficiency problems that had haunted Radeon for years. Better instructions per clock, cleaner power delivery, and a driver stack that had matured considerably all combined to create a generation that finally matched competitive performance with practical usability. The RX 5700 XT became a genuine alternative to NVIDIA's mainstream offerings in a way that felt earned rather than forced. For many enthusiasts, RDNA 1 was the generation they had been waiting for, the moment when choosing Radeon stopped requiring explanation. RDNA 2, expressed through the RX 6000 series, was when Radeon finally entered the modern feature conversation fully and without apology. Ray tracing, the lighting simulation technique that traces the physical behavior of light rays in real time, had been an NVIDIA-exclusive advantage for 2 years. The RX 6000 cards brought competitive ray tracing to AMD hardware alongside a genuinely innovative feature called the Infinity Cache, a large pool of very fast on-chip memory that dramatically increased effective memory bandwidth without the cost of adding more physical RAM. The results were striking. The RX 6800 XT competed directly with cards that cost significantly more from the competition. The RX 6950 XT challenged for 4K gaming supremacy. And for people who had already invested in AMD's Ryzen CPU ecosystem, the Smart Access memory feature, which allowed the CPU and GPU to share memory resources more efficiently, added a meaningful performance advantage that rewarded brand loyalty. Radeon was no longer catching up, it was competing on its own terms. The RX 7000 series, built on RDNA 3, brought refinement and scale. Rather than a single dramatic architectural revolution, RDNA 3 refined what worked about RDNA 2 and extended it across the entire product stack. Cache sizes grew. Efficiency improved. The chiplet design approach, borrowed from AMD's CPU division, allowed the company to build more complex GPUs from smaller, cheaper-to-manufacture dies assembled together. The flagship 7900 XTX delivered 4K performance that satisfied the most demanding users. The mid-range offerings scaled the technology down without sacrificing the fundamental character of the architecture. This was Radeon maturing, moving from the disruptive challenger to the established contender. And then came the 9000 series, and the future arrived ahead of schedule. RDNA 4 brought artificial intelligence into the rendering pipeline in earnest. FSR4 AMD Psi-powered upscaling technology joined a generation of hardware designed to work with it natively, delivering image quality that would have been unimaginable at equivalent resolutions just 5 years earlier. Ray tracing performance improved dramatically. Power efficiency reached levels that made previous generations look wasteful by comparison. The RX 9700 XT and 9800 XT represented something more than fast graphics cards. They represented a statement about where AMD believed computing was going: toward AI-assisted rendering, toward intelligent upscaling, toward efficiency as a competitive advantage rather than a limitation. From the Radeon 7000 in the year 2000 to the 9000 in 2025. 25 years of decisions, failures, recoveries, and reinventions, all in service of the same fundamental goal: making the world in front of you look more real. Here's what Radeon's story actually teaches if you're willing to hear it. Survival is not about being the best at any given moment. It's about being willing to rebuild after the moments when you weren't. ATI nearly lost the market with the HD 2900. They rebuilt. AMD absorbed losses during the Vega years without retreating from ambition. they rebuilt again. Every generation that felt like a stumble was followed by one that proved the stumble wasn't the end of the story. There is a lesson in that for anyone navigating a difficult period in business, in craft, in life. Reputation built on consistency survives individual failures. The question is never whether you will face a generation that doesn't work out. The question is what you do next. What was your own turning point? What was the generation, the moment, or the decision that changed how you saw the road ahead? Think about that. Because every story, including yours, has a recovery chapter waiting to be written. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel and share it with someone who appreciates what it takes to go from surviving to leading. We'll see you in the next one.